Welcome to this build on the 1/48 scale Airfix Blackburn Buccaneer S.2b, the later version, RAF version of the legendary low-level Cold War bomber. Really great to see the Airfix release this kit. The very first thing I did was at the instructions. There's 4 versions. They all have different armaments and loadouts. I did a bit of a mix and match. I didn't want the Sea Eagles on mine, but I did want to depict the 12 Squadron in the grey-green NATO type camo that the RAF employed, sort of like 80s up to 90s. Start off by drilling through the fuselage, the location points for the pylons. I just sort of make a note that I have got a full review for this kit. It is available on Patreon. So if you want to have a look on Patreon, I'm going to make that free. It's all for free members. Just sign up to Patreon. I initially started off by removing the large airframe structures from the sprues, doing the test fitting, did all the hole drilling. The last thing I wanted to do was to make a mistake on not having the holes available for the pylons, etc. And we proceed as usual with most of these builds with the cockpit. Got to say, the detail out the box on these ejector seats is not bad at all. Airfix have sort of upped their game, I think, with this kit. It's one of their later moldings and it turns out pretty good. To upgrade the cockpit, I used the QUINTA Studios 3D decal set. And in order to use that, you need to shave off all that lovely molded on detail. One thing that helps to smooth down the plastic is an application of liquid cement. Once we have all those pieces flattened from the detail, I inserted them into the cockpit. This just makes it easier to do all the base coating. And this part here is the front landing gear bay, which gets cemented in place underneath the cockpit. There is some good sidewall detail, and again I had to remove all the knobs and switches. And this is a great feature. This is actually a capsule for the nose weight, and they've made this an integral structure that fits into the nose, and all I did was fill this with some lead shot and cemented it in place using some super glue. Like to see this on a lot more kits. I think this is a great little innovation that they used. There you can see the area in which the nose weight capsule fits in. And these holes here are in order to fit the boarding ladder later on. Some modifications required to the plastic parts, including removing some of these boxes from the sidewall, and because that left a bit of a gap, I filled these in with some plastic card. I removed the ejection handles and also masked out the gun sight. Now, the only references to paints are those of Humbrol, so using an application you can find equivalencies. But the main thing really with using QUINTA 3D decal sets is really to find a paint that more closely matches the 3D decals themselves. I started off by applying a primer of Mr. Surfacer and decided to paint the ejection seats a very dark grey. I started off initially with this grey blue. I thought that was initially a good match to the 3D details, but I actually had to change this out. I think I used the light ghost grey, which is what is referenced for the cockpit itself anyways. It seemed to be quite a good match. A little bit of detail painting to do on the ejector seats. And to add some wear, I just gave this a light dry brush. Not much detail painting required for the cockpit itself. And I used some of the out of the bottle washes here just to add some depth to some of the cockpit parts. This is of course prior to the 3D details that are going to be added on soon. The reason I do it at this stage is not to obscure the details on the 3D decals. It gets blended with a little bit of white spirit or enamel thinner. And here is the detail set that I've chose to use. I've been using these for a number of years, and I find the easiest application is to use white glue or school glue. It affords enough time and able to you to move the decal into the correct position. And of course they perfectly align with the kit parts, so there's no trimming necessary, and because they're flexible vinyl type material, they conform very well to the kit parts. As a bonus, in this particular set you have got the detailing of the Martin Baker ejection seats, and this is a lot of stuff to add on actually. Lots of straps, and they build up in layers. It is actually, I found it better to do it in a few stages, adding on the basic harness and then adding on layers of the harness and straps on top of that after the glue had sort of cured on one set. If you see blobs of white glue, you can just basically brush that off using a paintbrush damp with some water. I fit the ejection seats into the canopy at this stage, and this is the end result. Really compact, fantastic detail, really spices things up in terms of the canopy. Now we can get this forward section. It's the very first part of the fuselage section. I'm just going to show you here, this is a segment of the instructions showing all this internal detail that gets fitted itself into the central portion of the fuselage. And this is what you end up with, this frame here. And the reason for this is that some of this detail, as you can see, is visible through the main landing gear bays. And what I did here is base coated this, I think, a gunmetal type colour, and added in some details. And unfortunately, what happened was during the masking process, as you'll see, I was left with a residue on top of the metallics, and this all had to be redone. And what I actually opted for, I think I used pigments in the end to actually affect the metallics of there, so it wasn't a big deal, but here we are using some pigment metallics to correct the areas that were unfortunately ruined by the paint residue. Now this structure gets glued into one half of the fuselage, and you end up with quite a very firm middle fuselage section. I have to say the fit is pretty good, not fantastic, but pretty good overall in this kit. There is some modifications you do, removing some of those one vortex generator from each wing. And this is the third component of the fuselage, the tail section, which is made of 3 pieces. Ended up dry fitting this together and then adding the cement together. What I tried to avoid was any steps in the construction. And the first thing that I did was to join this rear section to the middle, and this worked out okay, not perfect. I did still end up with a step, so it's necessary to do some sanding, etc., and some filling, as you'll see later on. But this is all pretty standard stuff. I wouldn't expect anything. There's very few manufacturers that get away with fitting without needing any putty or any corrections. Be mindful on this kit that there are some very large ejector pin knockout marks. Make sure you sand them down, or else you won't get a proper join of the parts. Now, in order to clean up my seams, I tend to use super glue. I use it neat, as in this case, or sometimes I add some baking soda on top. And you can see the main sort of areas were the rear portion of the engines near the nozzles, the nasal section, and also this front section here as well. But this all can be eliminated just by using normal techniques. Now, this area is noted as fill. What you're actually not doing is filling. You're removing this detail in order to make it correct for this S.2b version. I don't know what these are on the earlier version of the aircraft. Maybe somebody can tell me in the comments. But in any case, those get sanded off completely. And of course, finally, we correct in and restore the panel lines where necessary. Now we fit the front section to the fuselage, and this joint actually worked out quite good, didn't need that much correction. And the forward section of the air intakes gets glued on. Fit the bomb bay door. You have got the option to pose this open, but I didn't see the point as it's underneath the aircraft. And also I found out, varying from the instructions, that I could complete the tail section as a sub-assembly, and that could be left off for painting and fitment later on. The control surfaces don't have any tabs, they just simply slot into grooves on the wings, tailplane and rudder. And here's some detail of the resting hook. What I found was, like, this mast here was quite a thick part, so I sanded it down. And here we are, the very distinctive Clamshell Airbrake. Awesome feature. Of course, I wanted to pose this in the open position, rightly or wrongly, when the aircraft is parked up. This is the wings getting sub-assembled. The kit also gives you the option to pose the wings either folded or deployed. And another aftermarket detail that I used was a replacement pitot tube from a brass component from Master Models. Just a slight modification there to the pylon. And it also included a metal version of the air refueling probe nozzle. And that just simply got super glued into place, replacing the plastic part. This is the gear getting assembled, the front or nose landing gear, and I've got upgraded resin replacement wheel and tyre package. The detail's excellent. What I found was, in terms of the nose gear, perfect fit, but the main landing gear will not fit. They're not really compatible with the kit parts. So what I opted to do was to drill through the plastic parts and make my own axle. This of course allows me to fit the wheels as well later. We're already on to the fit out. Like I said, I varied from what actually the kit prescribes. And these are really great parts. They allow the aircraft to be fitted with FOD guards, boarding ladders, and they're all included within the kit. Really, really excellent parts included. Here we are, the main sub-assemblies now. Let's get painting the aircraft. I don't bother using detergents or anything, but I do like to brush away as much residue as possible. And we're using a surface primer on all the parts here. This is of course we're going to check the seams, going to unify the surface, and also it will enable me to do the next step as well. Helps of course to get a very smooth surface by giving it a very light sanding using sanding pad and I use some water as well, so it's a wet sand process, and this just makes the surface very, very smooth. Now what I used here was a watercolor type pencil in order to trace out the camouflage pattern onto the actual airframe itself. There's a number of ways to do this, but I found that this was one way that I like to do this. And I started off, usually you start off with the light colour, but in this case I opted for the green. My brain was saying to me, start off with the green. I just saw that much more clearly. So in this case, I wanted to create a little bit of a worn aircraft. So I'm trying to integrate some weathering into the painting scheme. And the way that I'm doing this is not by pre-shading, but using varying tones of that green. So I started off with the base NATO green to lay out the pattern, and where there would be panel lines, etc. I'm sort of tracing over them, as you can see, and also at the demarcation points of the camouflage and demarcation point of the parts themselves. I use the darker or the base color and then lighten down with some white, spraying into the middle portion to correct a sort of mottled, a little bit more of a worn pattern. And at this stage it looks far too contrasty, but what you'll do later on, or what I do later on, is overspray yet again using a middle tone, and you get this varied appearance. Now Buccaneers, the camouflage could be a hard edge or a soft edge. I wanted a hard edge in this particular example, so the only way to really do this is using masks, or in this case some flexible tape. Using the flexible tape is a bit of a chore, I must admit, because it doesn't really want to stick onto the airframe or onto the model itself. Preparing the clear transparent parts for masking, just give them light polish. I don't bother using a dip. I didn't have any masks for this model, so just using very thin masking tape and then some latex type gum to do the masking. Now I want the dark sea grey, and I'm repeating the process again using the base colour, the darker version of the dark sea grey, so the base colour to outline the parts and to also affect what would be panel line shading. And again, we take the lighter version, so we just add some white into the base colour and fill in the panels. Takes quite a lot of time, but also this you could say is a weathering step if you want to create a more varied appearance, the mottled appearance, and this is what I wanted to do on this particular build. Now we can get on spraying up some of the other details like these ECM pods and the PAVE spike pod. And you can see in some aircraft they actually had the nose cone a lighter grey, so I opted to pick that on my version. Quite a lot of masking was required on this particular model, especially in terms of the metallics. With metallics, you need a lot of masking, because if you get any overspray at all, what it does is basically stands out like a sore thumb on the parts. And also here I base painted the very distinctive chrome looking inlet nozzles. Demasking the wing fences, I think these are de-icing components. And detail painting now on a lot of the parts. A lot of the FOD guards and the boarding ladders were a red colour, which is a great contrast onto the actual overall look of the kit. And the landing gear here getting sprayed a light grey, which is very similar to the primer. The interior of the airbrake was another dark grey colour, as was the interior portion of the wing fold mechanisms. Do a bit of correction here where I've got overspray the metallics on the wings. And of course the canopy as well has a very distinctive tan type colour, so I use this colour radome. And I believe this is some sort of mastic or filler or something that's on the canopies. Because I've got a metal metallics on the aircraft at this stage, I used a gloss varnish, acrylic based one from Galleria, which is Winsor & Newton, and this gets applied over all parts of the model. And of course this is the preparation for the water stickers. A little bit more detail painting. And the Edouard BRASSIN wheel set had these included masks. So it was I think NATO black I used for the tyre, and then filled in the wheel component with the light grey. Remove the masks, and the job is nearly finished. And here we go with the water stickers, 12 squadron markings, these very big, distinctive roundels. I hadn't used Airfix water stickers for quite some time. I forgot about them. They're a little bit quirky in that they'll take some time to bed in, but when they bed in very, very well. Lots of technical inscriptions and stencils. I chose to use the most distinctive ones, of course, and some of them as well I omitted, well, for two reasons. One, it's extremely tedious. Two, as well, they can be quite garish as well. If they are a white or a yellow contrasting with the camouflage, they do need some work to tone down. Let's go into the first pass of the weathering, which of course is the panel line washing. As usual, I'm using Mr. Hobby black and brown mix to create this dark wash, and it's simply a case of spending a relaxing amount of time filling in these panel lines with the wash. And also, of course, we want to get some of that rivet detail captured. What I did notice, I think that this kit is actually upscaled from the 72 scale kit. I think the surface detail on the airframe could have been better. It seemed to be excellent on the wings, but the actual fuselage itself, you could see some areas where they'd omitted to add panel lines and details, but it still doesn't detract from the kit. I think overall this looked great. So using a cloth, we remove the excess wash from the airframe, and now we repeat it on all the details. And it's a good idea to apply a wash even on components that haven't got panel lines. The reason being that this actually, as it's wiped over the airframe or over the details, creates a slight filter. You do get a slight darkening effect, and you can use this, of course, as I say many times, you can use it as a paint as well to darken details on the model where appropriate. You can see the detail on this landing gear bay door is really exemplary. It looks really, really good. I'm using the old Tamiya makeup set, as it's called, just to add some soot type effects to the area of the outlets from the exhaust nozzles. And if you watch my A10 video, I went back to some old school techniques using Tamiya smoke, using a diluted mixture of this, and again this gets sprayed in areas that I noticed on the references were areas that had areas of grime. And also if you want to darken out further the panel lines, that's one way to do this. Now we add the flat varnish. It's a military aircraft. This Mr. Color GX flat you'll see the overall effect gives an actual, it sort of ends up being a semi-matte finish. And what I've started using, you know, going back again, thinking of things that I used to do long ago, using watercolor pencils again to add some wear effects. Just added some, I just wanted to highlight the details on these wheels. And finally I can assemble these by pushing that metal axle into place. Of course that rotates, but I'm going to lock them down with super glue. Let's start assembly. I added in these, I nearly missed these out actually, these pipes or something that go into the gear bay. And you can see that some aircraft do have weathering on them. They're not all neat, they're not all perfect. And of course these are the inspirational images that I'll use in order to recreate the weathering. So we're using oil paints, blacks, browns, ochres. And following references, what we're adding is we're sort of drawing on the streaks of weathering as they would appear. And of course on aircraft, sadly most of the weathering is underneath the aircraft, particularly around this bomb bay. You can imagine these sort of leaks, etc., from oils, hydraulic fluids, etc., and that gets streaked back in the direction of the airflow. And to further blend that, we use a brush, either dry or very slightly moist with some turpentine, white spirits, enamel thinners. They all have the same effect. So if you choose your point of origin for these streaks, you just simply work them back. And a cotton swab as well will really help with diffusing the look and creating quite a natural appearance. Didn't go too heavy on here, but this is a stippling technique. Again, the oils are placed on and we create areas of grime on the airframe. These panels in particular, as you saw in the references, they must have been removed frequently and had lots of grimy hands on them or something of that effect. But I certainly wanted to recreate what I saw on the images. And also, in order to fade down the roundels, which are very bright, the colour on them is excellent, I used a little bit of white oil paint and that got stippled on. And again, with a pencil, you can add some very, very slight nicks and paint chipping effects. At last we can start unmasking the aircraft. The final aftermarket detail is this detonation cord for the front and rear canopy. These are slightly offset. The pilot and navigator's position are offset in the aircraft, which is quite interesting. Let's paint some final details. Using Mr. Metal Colour, these get buffed to a finish. And I scratch built the wiper myself. The aircraft has two options. Gear fit on this kit was excellent. There was no problems at all with them. They're very firm attachment points. They fit in great, as do the landing gear bay doors. These nearly click into place, really excellent. And I found that I could add in these metal inlet nozzles or nacelles right at the very end, so that saved me a job in terms of masking. Let's fit on these ECM pods, the aerials, the tail plane. There we are, the wiper getting fitted into place on the windscreen and the front section of the canopy. Final details getting added on now, and now these real highlight parts, they're even marked on where they fit, so you can't mess that up unless you don't know which side port is, of course. So you get front, rear, and of course the clamshell airbrake gets fitted in. That is the navigator's blast shield. And a little bit of weathering on the access boarding ladders, using first of all sponge method and then a wash. And these get fitted into place. They need to be glued into position. And finally the air-to-air refueling nozzle. The wings fit so great they can be dry fitted into position. And there we go. Hope you enjoyed the build, guys, and see you on the next one.